In the heart of Europe, King Leopold II was praised as a visionary monarch, a man dedicated to bringing progress and civilization to distant lands. But behind this polished image lay one of history's darkest secrets, a reign of terror that consumed millions of innocent lives in Africa. In the Congo Free State, a land he claimed as his personal possession, the world witnessed a scale of suffering almost unimaginable. Leopold never raised a sword in battle, yet his policies and greed orchestrated the deaths of over 10 to 20 million people. Entire villages were wiped from the map, families destroyed, and children mutilated, all in the name of rubber and ivory. This was not simply colonization, it was one of the greatest crimes against humanity. Today, we uncover the horrifying story of the deadliest king in history, a man who turned paradise into hell. Who was King Leopold II? King Leopold II of Belgium rose to power in 1865, inheriting a small and relatively unimportant nation compared to Europe's great empires. Unlike Britain, France, or Spain, Belgium had no colonies, and Leopold believed this diminished his legacy. Obsessed with wealth and prestige, he dreamed of creating an empire that would rival the most powerful nations. He knew Belgium alone could never dominate Europe, so he turned his eyes toward Africa, a continent rich in resources but vulnerable to exploitation. Leopold was clever, ambitious, and above all, ruthless. He understood how to manipulate appearances, cloaking his hunger for conquest under the guise of philanthropy. To the world, he posed as a benevolent ruler, but inside, his greed was insatiable. Behind closed doors, Leopold was calculating every step, preparing to seize land thousands of miles away. He attended international meetings and cleverly presented himself as a humanitarian, insisting he wanted to end slavery and spread Christianity. But this was only a mask, carefully crafted to win favor from global leaders. In truth, his vision was not for Africa's people, but for their resources, their labor, and ultimately, their lives. He sought total control, not for Belgium as a state, but for himself as an individual king. By building alliances and creating false promises, he positioned himself as a leader destined to save Africa. What the world didn't realize was that Leopold's salvation was nothing more than a death sentence for millions. The creation of the Congo Free State. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 became the turning point for Africa's fate, as European powers carved the continent like a pie. Leopold played his part with extraordinary cunning, convincing the world that he was establishing a charitable mission in Central Africa. He claimed he wanted to protect native people, abolish slavery, and bring trade opportunities that would benefit all. His performance was convincing, and the great powers believed his lies. By the end of the conference, Leopold was handed control of the Congo, a land 76 times the size of Belgium, as his personal property, not as a colony of the state. This was unprecedented, an entire country granted to one man. For the people of Congo, this moment marked the beginning of decades of suffering and unimaginable cruelty. Once he gained control, Leopold named his empire the Congo Free State, a title dripping with irony as freedom had no place there. The king quickly transformed it into a vast labor camp, with himself as the overseer and master. He exploited every inch of land, forcing Congolese men, women, and children into grueling labor. Armed enforcers known as the Force Publique were deployed to ensure absolute obedience. Villages that resisted were burned, and those who disobeyed were punished in ways that horrified even the harshest of colonizers. The Congo Free State became a factory of suffering hidden from the outside world by a carefully constructed wall of lies. Leopold's philanthropy was nothing but a mask for mass murder. If you believe stories like this must be told and never forgotten, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring hidden history to light and keep the memory of the victims alive. The exploitation of rubber and ivory. The late 19th century saw a massive surge in the global demand for rubber, driven by bicycles, cars, and industrial machinery. Leopold seized this opportunity, turning the Congo into the world's largest rubber extraction site. But instead of building industries or paying wages, he used sheer brutality to force locals into compliance. Men were required to meet impossible rubber quotas, climbing dangerous trees, and working endless hours under the lash of whips. Failure meant punishment, not only for the worker, but for his entire family. Women were taken hostage, children killed, and elders mutilated, but as examples of what happened when quotas were not met. The ivory trade followed the same pattern, stripping the land while leaving behind broken lives. This exploitation was not just about profit, it became a system of terror. Leopold's agents enforced quotas with unimaginable cruelty, cutting off hands as proof that bullets were not wasted. Villagers were massacred when they resisted, their homes burned to ash. Hunger and disease spread like wildfire, as communities could no longer farm or live peacefully. Rubber and ivory lined Leopold's pockets while blood stained the soil of Africa. In Europe, he lived in splendor, building palaces and monuments with his fortune, admired by many who saw only his wealth. But every brick and stone of his empire was cemented with the suffering of Congo. Behind the glory stood millions of voiceless victims whose cries were never heard by the world. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the exploitation was only the beginning. What followed were atrocities so brutal that survivors carried scars not just on their bodies, but deep within their souls. Atrocities and human suffering. The Congo under Leopold became a land where death was routine and suffering was law. His private army, the Force Publique, terrorized the land with rifles, whips, and chains. Men were forced to collect rubber, while women were held hostage and children executed if quotas were missed. Soldiers often cut off the hands of the dead, and when bullets were wasted, they cut hands from the living to make their count appear correct. Entire villages were torched, leaving survivors wandering homeless and broken. Stories of children being taken as hostages and never returned became horrifyingly common. For millions, life became a prison of endless labor and fear. What made the suffering worse was the silence, the world's ignorance of what was happening in Africa's heart. Leopold hid the truth behind grand speeches of progress and civilization, fooling European nations into thinking he was a humanitarian. But inside Congo, the people lived a nightmare, where even survival meant constant humiliation and abuse. Starvation spread as crops went untended, families starved while forced to gather rubber, and disease thrived in weakened bodies. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were beaten or killed, unable to stop the cruelty of soldiers. The psychological scars ran just as deep as the physical wounds, with trauma that lasted generations. Congo had become a graveyard under the shadow of Leopold's greed. Victim stories, sad cases. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Leopold's reign were the individual tragedies that revealed the human face behind the numbers. Eyewitnesses described children tied to posts, whipped until their skin peeled away, simply because their father had failed rubber quotas. Women were dragged into soldiers' camps, assaulted and beaten, their cries echoing across burned villages. Families were torn apart, fathers killed for defiance, mothers forced to labor, and children mutilated as punishments. Missionaries reported entire villages emptied overnight, where silence replaced once thriving communities. The pain was not abstract. It was carved into the lives of ordinary people who only wanted to live in peace. Each story carried a weight too heavy for the world to ignore. One case that shocked observers was of hostages taken when villages failed to deliver rubber. Soldiers would lock up wives and children in filthy cages without food or water, while men were sent into the forest to collect rubber in desperation. If they returned empty-handed, they found their families dead or maimed. Others told of soldiers who carried baskets of severed hands as proof of punishment. Mothers recounted how they had to choose between surrendering their children or being beaten to death themselves. These stories tore at the heart of those who managed to witness them, proving the system was not just cruel but deliberately inhuman. Victims' voices, though silenced in many ways, echo through history as a testimony to suffering that must never be forgotten. The death toll, how many died? The numbers tied to Leopold's Congo are staggering, so vast that even historians struggle to grasp the scale. Conservative estimates suggest at least 10 million people died, while some argue the true toll may have reached over 20 million. This makes Leopold responsible for one of the largest genocides in recorded history. The deaths came not only from executions and mutilations, but from the collapse of society itself. Families starved as men were torn from farms to labor for rubber. Diseases spread unchecked, claiming countless lives, weakened by hunger and despair. Generations were wiped out, and with them, entire cultures and traditions. The sheer size of the Congo meant that whole regions could be devastated without the outside world ever noticing. Missionaries returning to Europe told stories of empty villages and skeletons lining the roads. In some areas, populations dropped by half in only a few years. The destruction was not just physical, but spiritual, erasing identities, customs, and languages. Villages that once sang with life now lay silent under the shadow of Leopold's greed. When one measures the death toll, it rivals or surpasses the bloodshed of later dictators. Yet in Europe, Leopold still basked in glory, detached from the rivers of blood flowing in Africa. Exposure and international outrage. For years, Leopold's mask of benevolence held strong, hiding the truth from much of the world. But gradually, witnesses began to speak out. Missionaries and travelers returned with shocking testimonies of mutilations, starvation, and mass killings. One of the most courageous voices was journalist E.D. Morel, who discovered that ships arriving in Belgium from Congo carried only rubber and ivory, while those departing carried guns and chains. He realized this was not trade, it was slavery and murder disguised as progress. Roger Casement, a British consul, confirmed these horrors in an official report that stunned the world. Their courage lit the spark of outrage that could no longer be ignored. The Congo Reform Association became one of the first major human rights movements, campaigning tirelessly to expose Leopold's crimes. Newspapers published graphic accounts, shocking readers who once believed Leopold was a hero. Public opinion shifted, and governments were forced to respond. Britain, America, and other nations condemned his actions, demanding reform. international pressure built like a storm, threatening to topple Leopold's carefully constructed image. For the first time, the cries of Congo's victims began to be heard beyond their borders. The world was finally waking up to the truth of Leopold's bloody empire. The end of Leopold's rule. By the early 1900s, Leopold's lies began to crumble as evidence piled up. Under immense pressure, he reluctantly agreed to transfer control of the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908. But before surrendering his empire, he ordered countless documents destroyed, trying to erase the evidence of his crimes. Even as his reputation collapsed, Leopold never admitted guilt, never showed remorse for the millions of lives lost. To him, the Congo was merely an investment that had paid well. He lived out his last days in luxury, hiding behind the walls of his palaces. The wealth built on blood continued to finance monuments and estates that stand even today. When Leopold died in 1909, church bells in Belgium rang as if for a great leader. But for many, his death was a relief, a final end to a tyrant who had murdered without mercy. His funeral procession passed in silence as crowds turned their backs, refusing to honor him. The man who had dreamed of being remembered as a great king left behind a legacy of shame and death. His empire crumbled, but the scars he left in Congo endured for generations. Even today, reminders of his cruelty echo in the suffering of a people who paid the price for one man's greed. Leopold's name has become synonymous with hypocrisy and horror. The moral lesson. Warning. The story of King Leopold II is more than history. It is a warning about what happens when unchecked power and greed are allowed to thrive. He cloaked himself in the language of progress, religion, and civilization, but beneath that mask was nothing but exploitation and death. His crimes remind us that not everyone who claims to serve humanity or God can be trusted. Leaders can use noble words to hide the darkest intentions, and millions can suffer because of blind faith in authority. The Congo Free State stands as proof of the destruction that comes when human lives are valued less than profit. We must remember these lessons, not just to honor the dead, but to guard the living. Because history has shown us that silence and ignorance are the greatest allies of tyranny. If you believe this story must be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these forgotten voices alive, ensuring their suffering is never erased from history.